Next speaker is Sarah Glynn. Sarah's part of an active in, and I believe a founder of, Scottish. I'll wait for it. The front seats never get taken.
The front seats, yeah.
Front seats never get taken. It's a religion in this country. This is a taboo. It is. These mean you. Hell opens up in front of these seats. There we go. Sarah's is a strong and clear voice, challenging the claim by the Zionist leaders who claim to represent the Scottish Jewish community, or Scottish Jews in general, that is challenged. So it's a pleasure to ask you to listen to Sarah Glynn from Scottish Jews Against Zionism.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Just a very brief introduction to Scottish Jews Against Zionism. We actually founded as a response to the stooshy about the march last year, and the realisation that we needed a specifically anti-Zionist Jewish voice. So, you know, that's absolutely clear where we stand. We stand against Zionism, and obviously we stand against Zionism as racism, and we are absolutely opposed to being on an anti-racist march. But what I was going to actually step back a little bit and just try and set it into some sort of context, and particularly we've had the political context in the US, and it was, I think, particularly powerful to hear that voice from that background in Glasgow's merchant city. But anyway, I'm going to now return to the British situation very specifically. And if someone had told me 5 years ago that the Daily Mail would be accusing lifelong anti-racist Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism, and that Labour Party anti-Semitism, in quotes, would dominate British news, I think I'd have been tempted to question their sobriety. But this is now part of the new normal. And while the nature of media has changed, there's actually nothing very new about this sort of propaganda and this sort of very deliberate twisting. So we could just look at the writings of George Orwell, or the victims of McCarthy, or of Stalin's purges, or even the 17th century witch trials. So just in case anyone's in any doubt, I'll just say firmly at the beginning that what is happening has absolutely nothing to do with preventing anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, and we've heard quite rightly that, you know, it's all forms of racism, there's no sort of Jewish exceptionalism here, are used as tools by elites to divide working class resistance and distract people from realising who are their real exploiters. And it's always been the left's role to expose what is happening and show that racism is a false understanding. Anti-Semitism was described in the 19th century as the socialism of fools, not because it was socialist, but because it prevented people from understanding socialist ideas. So the Daily Mail and the baying right wing haven't suddenly forgotten their class interests and discovered an anti-racist conscience. And if we're to end this attack, we need to understand and expose what's really happening and whose interests it serves. There have, of course, always been individual chancers who attempt to stave off any criticism by claiming that it's only been made because of their ethnic minority status. But Zionists have increasingly made this argument into a guiding principle. They've been unable to combat the growing support for the Palestinian cause and for BDS through the legitimate argument, and so they've resorted to denouncing anyone who criticises Zionism as anti-Semitic. They insist that Zionism is integral to Judaism. So they are effectively, cynically, unilaterally, and ahistorically redefining what it means to be a Jew. Zionism is actually a political movement that arose along with other nationalist movements in the 19th century. Not only is Zionism not intrinsic to Judaism, support for it has always been debated among Jews. And in fact, my own realisation of the deeply problematic nature of Zionism came from reading the old debates from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The very many Jews who campaigned for socialist internationalism argued that Jews should stay and fight for their rights in the different societies in which they lived as part of the wider working class. And the arguments from those who called themselves socialist Zionists, well, that just didn't make sense. How could anyone claim to build a socialist society on the back of settler colonialism? In Scottish Jews Against Zionism, or Scottish Jazz, it sounds a bit nicer, I think, we're quite clear that any state that prioritises one ethnicity over others is inherently racist. And so we oppose Zionism as a racist ideology.
Yeah.
The current Israeli government is not afraid to make that racism very blatant, but it has always been there. It's in the foundation of the State of Israel, as a specifically Jewish state. So, for example, and I know there are people here, and Nick's been much better at giving a whole range of examples, but just the obvious example, I could claim Israeli nationality as a Jew, as could my daughter, since Judaism is inherited down the female line, but Palestinians who were forced to flee from their ancestral lands in 1948 have no right of return. The main tool that Zionists have used to push their anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism line is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, or rather its associated examples. So this definition and its examples were developed in 2003 to 5, and they were developed as a working draft by the European Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia, who wanted some sort of standard that allowed them to monitor anti-Semitism in different countries. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was founded in 1998 as a task force for Holocaust education, remembrance and research, and they decided, rather than write their own definition and think about it, just to adopt this definition wholesale in 2016. The definition has always had critics as well as supporters, and even its main author, Kenneth Stern, has spoken against how it's used to shut down academic debate and has argued against it being given legal status. The problems aren't the actual definition itself, but in some of the examples attached to it, which very deliberately conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. In particular, these two: denying the Jewish people their right of self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So these examples would seek to make it impossible to put forward really important political arguments without being branded anti-Semitic. Of course, you don't actually have to be anti-Zionist to argue that the conflation of Zionism and Judaism is wrong. But if you are anti-Zionist, and publicly so, you can expect a torrent of very personal online abuse from complete strangers. You will certainly be called a Gino, which apparently stands for Jew in name only, but also much worse. I've been called a capo, like the prisoners who worked with the Nazis in the concentration camps. And in fact, you're subject to a virtual inquisition by people for whom anti-Zionism is an offence that should be punished by excommunication. So unsurprisingly, perhaps, there are still relatively few Jews who want to make a public statement against Zionism. But I think there are many more who feel that way in private, or who are at least beginning to question a political stance that they may well have inherited and grown up with. Some are afraid of alienating other members of their Jewish community, though some of those members may, privately be undergoing similar uncertainties themselves. Or they may be afraid of upsetting their family or Israeli relations. Others may be kept in line by Zionist propaganda that's very effective at portraying all critics of Israel as anti-Semitic, and really stoking the flames of community fear. And there was a really interesting example of this actually from Labour Voice of Israel has just exposed a real abuse of statistics in trying to claim a level of anti-Semitism among Palestinian supporters, which absolutely isn't there. And it's a really nice little article which we've shared on our Scottish Jazz Facebook page. You can find it there, or you can of course find it on its original place on the Jewish Voice for Labour. So this concerted miscalling of anti-Semitism has no doubt, I think, slowed the growth of anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian campaigning, and it succeeded to some extent in distracting attention from Israel's brutal war against the Palestinians. It's a really high-risk strategy that, among other things, can serve to increase real anti-Semitism, as I'll discuss later. However, the anti-Semitism scare hasn't dominated news headlines in the UK just because of the action of a small lobby of Zionists. The game changer has been its adoption by the establishment right wing as a very useful tool with which to attack the left. The surprise election of the unelectable Jeremy Corbyn as an openly socialist leader of the Labour Party has caused them to panic at the prospect of a genuinely Labour government. As right-wing politicians and media looked around for ways to bring Corbyn down and nip any thoughts of socialism in the bud, they realised the potential of the anti-Semitism scare and of the IHRA definition. Along with much of the progressive left, Corbyn has been an outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights. And so those who sought to destroy him began trawling through social media and old news reports to find any careless form of phrase that could be twisted to suggest anti-Semitic tendencies in Corbyn and his supporters. Among the worst witch hunters have been the Labour right, who would rather see the Tories re-elected than a Corbyn-led government, much to the delight of the Tories and the mainstream anti-left media. But despite all this trawling, the actual haul has been remarkably unimpressive, as the recent statistics produced by the Labour Party testify. Labour is a mass party, so it would be extraordinary if no members had any anti-Semitic views. But as we would expect, levels of anti-Semitism are very low, and much lower than among those on the right. And I suspect that even if we were to look at those actions that have been identified as anti-Semitic, few will be the result of actual anti-Semitic convictions, as distinct from careless wording or easily rectified ignorance. In fact, stupidity is a much more prevalent problem than anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, every find becomes another stick with which to beat the left. And the charges are particularly effective because people on the left are especially concerned that they're not seen as anti-Semitic, and they really don't want to be anti-Semitic. And this smear campaign, I think, exploits the left's genuine concern over racism and prejudice, turning it against itself like some sort of autoimmune disease. Instead of dismissing the portrayal of their party as a hotbed of anti-Semitism for the gross exaggeration that it clearly is, Labour set itself the impossible task of seeking out every conceivable anti-Semitic stain. In doing this, they're just succeeding in feeding the narrative that anti-Semitism is a Labour or socialist problem. And however much they appease their accusers, the attacks won't stop until Corbyn is destroyed, because this was never about anti-Semitism. And that is the point, which is why the silencing of Chris Williamson for daring to raise these issues is so frightening. A different sort of worrying silence is that of a section of the independent supporting left who have let their frustrations at Labour's British nationalism, quite right frustrations in my view, lull them into celebrating Labour's misfortunes as though they had no wider importance. This pernicious smear campaign should be of major concern to everyone who wants to see a more progressive society, whatever their relationship to the Labour Party. The sabotaging of the chances of a more socialist government in the UK affects us all, and smear tactics aren't limited by political party. If the smearers aren't stopped, others will be next. This major attack on the left has huge implications for the future of social relations in the UK, for UK foreign policy in the Middle East, for the health of left movements everywhere, for the future of our planet in a capitalist world that refuses to take the steps needed to avoid climate catastrophe. It also has implications for racism and anti-Semitism. Damage the chances of a more left-wing government that can begin to reverse inequality, and you encourage the conditions on which racism thrives. And when we look specifically at anti-Semitism, there are additional dangers. Cry wolf too many times, and when the real wolf appears, no one notices. Insist, despite the evidence, that supporters of Palestine are anti-Semitic and Jews should be wary of them, and you build walls of distrust. And beyond this, it's deeply dangerous to associate all Jews, as Jews, with a racist state and a major right-wing smear campaign. There are, undoubtedly, some very right-wing Jews involved in all this, not least in the Jewish Board of Guardians, which claims to represent British Jews. But as I said, Jews, like any other community, encompass a wide range of political beliefs. Centuries of oppression ensure that there's a long history of Jewish involvement in progressive struggle. And in Scottish jazz, we like to think of ourselves as part of that progressive tradition. But we recognise that we can no more take credit for this part of Jewish history than we can be blamed for Israeli oppression. We all of us have to take responsibility for our own actions.